Welcome, everyone. I'm Joy, your host for 84,000 in Conversation. The topic today is the 5 protections, Pañcarakṣā, a Buddhist approach to healthcare. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that Chinese interpretation is available for today's event. So if you need it, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen to enter the interpretation room. I'll just give everyone a few seconds to shuffle rooms as needed. All right. So today we're very happy to have Dr. James Gentry with us to share his insights on the 5 protection scriptures, which he translated for the 84,000 reading room. Dr. James Gentry is assistant professor of religious studies at Stanford University. He specializes in Tibetan Buddhism with a particular focus on the literature and history of its tantric traditions. He is the author of Power Objects in Tibetan Buddhism, The Life, Writings, and Legacy of Soktokpa Lodrö Gyaltsen, which was published by Brill in 2017. The book examined the role of tantric material and sensory objects in the lives and institutions of Tibetan and Himalayan Buddhists. His current project is a history of the Mani pill and other Buddhist medico-ritual pill traditions in Tibet. Today, we'll be exploring the role of the 5 protections in Buddhist approaches to healthcare, its history and practice across the Buddhist world, with a special focus on its translation and transmission in Tibet. We'll be taking some questions from the audience at the end, so please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box. All right. Let me bring James in now to start this 84,000 in Conversation event. Hi, James. It's so good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Joy. Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you. Too. It's great to see you too. Thank you for getting up so early to be part of this conversation with me today.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure.
So we're here today to talk about a set of 5 Buddhist scriptures called the Pañcarakṣā, or in English, the 5 protections. Could you first just briefly describe for us what these texts are? What are they about? What do they contain? Why were these texts grouped together as a set of 5?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So the Pañcarakṣā, or 5 protections, as I've been translating it, and we at 84,000 have translated this group of texts, is of course a group of 5 Buddhist scriptures that probably circulated separately at first, but were at some point prior to their translation into Tibetan in the late 8th or 9th century brought together and combined into a small collection. The texts appear together in the Kriya Tantra section of the Kangyur collections, and in the 84,000 collection under the following titles in this order. So this is the order that they appear in the Kangyurs. So it's a Destroyer of the Great Trichiliocosm, the Great Peahen, the Great Amulet, the Great Cool Grove, and Great Upholder of the Secret Mantra. So different Sanskrit versions of the final 2 has led the scholar Peter Skilling to speak of 7 different texts rather than 5, but actually only 5 of these are rendered into Tibetan, and only 5 are depicted in iconography and sculpture. So it's actually unclear when exactly or why these 5 texts were grouped together, but it likely has to do with shared themes, which we'll get to later, and the tantric impulse of organizing deities according to a 5-fold mandala pattern with central deities surrounded by deities in the 4 surrounding directions and so forth. So the designation 5 protections, which could be translated as 5 protectors too, because denotes the set of texts, the incantations or dharanies or mantras, if you will, that are presented there, and the goddesses too presiding over each. So they could be personified as 5 protectors as well. And each text promises protection from a specific range of misfortunes. So included are poisonous snake bites, illnesses of all sorts, losing one's way, robbery, natural disasters of all kinds, criminal punishments, pandemics, and so forth, but with a lot of overlap witnessed between the texts. So as part of this protective function, they also guarantee well-being in the form of wealth, happiness, offspring, family and communal harmony, state protection, and other kinds of positive outcomes. But in addition to these pragmatic aims, each text also contains some allusions to more lofty doctrinal goals, if you will. So the range of effects described sometimes, although it admittedly rarely extends beyond the pragmatic sphere, to include the purification of negative karma, deliverance from the lower realms, and even the attainment of Buddhahood. Owing to its mundane emphasis and its call for integrating all five into ritual performances, I've been thinking of this collection as a kind of practical canon in use. So as such, I mean, what I mean by that will become clear a little bit later, I think, when we get into the conversation. But in short, it's that its ritual and textual boundaries tend to be more porous than more formalized canonical collections. Part of that is in their very formation. They draw from earlier Pali Vinaya texts, suttas, jatakas, paritas. Then they've become Mahayana sutras, then dharanis, and then even tantras. So that's in short what they're about. In terms of formal features, they're, of course, like all Buddhist scriptures, are most embedded in quite interesting narrative frameworks. So the narratives themselves are quite lovely and interesting too, beyond just the incantations that they include and the rituals.
Thank you for that. You mentioned just now that each of the texts are associated with a goddess. Who are these goddesses? I'm just curious. Is it related to Tara at all, or are they different protector goddesses?
They are the goddesses that are the titles of the text, actually. So that the texts themselves become personified in the form of goddesses. So, Mahasahasra Pramardani is one, and the Mahapratisara becomes the central figure, actually, eventually in this fivefold mandala. And then the other three, Mahamayuri and the Maha Mantra Anudarani or Anusarani, depending on the version, kind of flank the central figure around. Of course,
that's so interesting.
The Mahashitavani, the great cool grove, I left out.
Right. That's so interesting. That's like kind of like Prajna Paramita becoming personified as a goddess, because it's like the Dharani itself is the goddess. The amulet is the goddess. That's very interesting. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. Sure.
So you actually translated all five of these texts for 84,000. You translated from Tibetan into English. But I'm also curious about the history of the transmission of these texts to Tibet in the first place. Can you tell us what you know about the history of these texts? When were they translated into Tibetan? What do we know about that? What was the early Tibetan reception of these texts?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you what I know, which isn't, unfortunately, it's not a complete picture, but we do know that the texts were translated around the year 800 because of their appearance in early imperial period catalogs, translation catalogs. So they were translated around the year 800, probably early 9th century, under the auspices of Tibetan imperial patronage. And Tibetans received the five texts then as a coherent group. So they were already brought together into a little mini canon, as it were. And they were classified then as the five great dharani, or Zung Chenbonga. And that designation changed over time. So only later would these be known as the Zungchen Dranga, which is almost the same. I mean, to translate it, really, maybe it would be fivefold great dharani instead of, five great dharani. So the English doesn't reflect the change so well. But also included in the Kangyur collections are extracts of important mantras, prayers, medicine incantations, actually. So directed specifically to the incantation of medicinal substances, and proclamations of truth. So different formulations that are said to have efficacy when enunciated, either individually or as a group. And these are presented as separate texts, although they're derived from the five within the Kongyurs. And some of those started to be translated during the imperial period, but most of them were translated only later, between the 10th and 12th centuries. So the Tangyur collections are actually a great source for learning more about these, because there we have commentaries on 4 of the 5 scriptures, as well as a range of sadhana and other liturgical texts related to each, and to the collection as a whole, actually. So they're integrated at that point. However, the majority of those Indian commentaries and tantric sadhana practices connected with the texts are, they reflect a much later period of the development of the 5, or I guess you could say the integration of the 5 into a 5-part mandala. And they weren't translated, most of them, until 11th, 12th century. So these later translations reflect significant developments in tantric practice that transpired in India during the intervening 200 years or so. So that makes them a very fascinating subject of study for the development of Indian Tantra as well, not just in Tibet. But the Sanskrit manuscripts that we have, for the most part, although there are some exceptions, typically date to no earlier than the 11th century. So there are hundreds of these manuscripts actually in Nepal, because there was very popular to copy them. So these attest to a later manuscript tradition than what we have reflected in the Tibetan translations, by and large. And I'll explain that in a little bit, but they correspond more with what we find in the later Tibetan translations of the commentaries that are in the Tangyur and those sadhanas and associated ritual texts. But the Tibetan translators edited these earlier 9th century Tibetan translations of the actual Pañcarakṣā texts, often in consultation with Sanskrit manuscripts that reflect even later developments in the manuscript tradition. So it's a very messy situation, or different recensions entirely. And some of this is recorded in the colophons, so you can see kind of echoes of this when you look in the translations, the 84,000 translations. So like Golotsawa Shunupel, for example, the famous 14th century Kagyu master, edited one of the texts based on a Sanskrit manuscript that he had in his possession. So the translation and study of these 5, including comparison with the Tibetan translations of associated texts, is, for me, and I mean for a lot of scholars, really, I think a really important first step in determining how Tibetans during and after the imperial period received, interpreted, and edited these texts, and just tantric texts in general. But a lot of research remains to be done on this. I mean, other areas of Asia in which these texts were important have been studied, but not so much Tibet. But in terms of the Tibetan reception, we know that they were popular enough pretty early on to be discovered in the cave libraries of Dunhuang. So we have evidence of these in the Dunhuang caves, which so we can date these to no later than, say, 1030. We also know that every generation of Tibetan Buddhist scholar from the 13th century to the present was influenced by the Indian commentaries and liturgical works that were composed in India by really very illustrious Indian scholars like Buddha Jnanapada, Jitari, Abhayakaragupta, Karmavajra, and Ratnakarashanti. So the Tibetan scholars were particularly influenced by the appearance of the mandalic configuration of the 5 together, where they've been already personified as goddesses, and that appears in different tantric compendia that were brought together in India, like the Nishpana Yogavali, which is attributed to Abhayakaragupta, and the Sadhanamala, and different ritual texts attributed to Ratnakarashanti. So then when we look at sort of take stock of who in Tibet wrote on these, it's like a who's who of illustrious, amazing figures in Tibetan history across all sectarian traditions. So, of course, Bhutan, Rinchen Drup. We have Bodong Penchen, Chole Namgyal writing ritual texts. Morchen Kunga Sampo, Shakya Chokden, Chudrak Yeshe, the fourth Shamar, Jetsun Tarnata, Rizin Chukitrapa, the famous Drikungpa, Ngawan Losan Chuden, famous figures in the Drupa Kagyu like Kamtul, Tenzin Shukinima, and a lot of Sakya figures beyond Shakya Chokden like Gunga Lodru, others, and even Mipam Rinpoche wrote on this. And then we have it even, we have several texts in Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo's Druptap Kundu devoted to the Pañcarakṣā, especially the Mahamayuri for one reason or another.
That's the Great Pihen.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm trying to stick with the English names, but sometimes I forget. Yeah, Great Pihen. Exactly. Thanks.
Right. Wow, that's really a very illustrious list of people who commented on these texts. Is the Pañcarakṣā as a term something that we find in Sanskrit texts? So like this grouping of 5, or does it seem like it's really a Tibetan development?
We do find the Pañcarakṣā in Sanskrit. Yeah. So that's something that it looks to appear only with, not in the texts themselves, but only with their later mandalization, when they become integrated into a 5-fold mandala. So we get this sungwanga, this expression in Tibetan, which literally translates Pañcarakṣā, and in Sanskrit manuscripts from a later period that appears. In one of the Pañcarakṣā texts, this destroyer of the Great Trichiliocosm, all 5 are listed.
I see.
So
okay.
This one is first in the list, actually, as it appears in the Kangyur. But this one was the one that was revised later by Gulatsawa Shinapel. So it reflects actually kind of much later Sanskrit, manuscript tradition. So that's why you have the 5 included there, and there's some gesture toward integrating them already, but that reflects a later development. It's a bit of a bit deceptive to see in that something from the earlier period.
That's really interesting. So in a way, this set of 5 scriptures, within it, you can see the kind of back and forth kind of dialogue between Indian Tantric Buddhism and Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, and in the development of its history. That's very interesting. And but it seems like it was in Tibet where they really kind of developed a commentarial tradition on this set of texts. So that's very interesting. All right, so because the 5 texts are in some ways very explicitly about things like disease, epidemics, and they're about calamities of all sorts. And these are issues that are very much present in our collective consciousness these days. These texts just seem to have had a very deep awareness of perils of all sorts. So what sort of influence has the 5 protections, this set of texts? What influence has it had on Buddhist approaches to things like diseases and catastrophes?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's really been considerable. So they were hugely popular. There's evidence that they're popular really across the Buddhist world, and almost everywhere that Mahayana touched, including Southeast Asia. So, and the fact that so many illustrious Tibetan lamas wrote on these texts shows that they were quite influential as a kind of approach. So what's quite interesting, I think, is that there's a change. There are several different approaches actually encapsulated in each text. and that might be read in different ways. So you might think of that as even historical layers in the formation of different medicinal approaches that then become combined into a holistic approach. So what I mean, or not, maybe these were all kind of, contemporaneous and they're just all kind of combined in. But what we have basically is one very simple approach, which is a sort of words of truth approach is how I like to think of it. This kind of formulation that, you see it often if as Buddha is my witness, may he strike me down if this is not true, or something like this, or if such and such is the case, may it be so, and then a formulation will be expressed, and that's said to have efficacy. And these are very simple proclamations, such as the refuge formulation or praise to the three jewels or what have you, and that's kind of doing the protecting. So that's sort of, and that's in a way extensive with the healing presence of Buddha himself, you could say. So it's kind of known that when the Buddha would go into different areas, there would be healing that would take place automatically through his presence. Mm-hmm. And so then that kind of segues into a dharani or mantra incantation approach, in which the syllables, and you'll see this especially in the Great Peahen, they're largely incomprehensible syllables. They're not translatable and probably mm-hmm. not even intended to be translated. And those are what do the work. And then mm-hmm. we have the introduction of rituals or little ritual vignettes or vidis in Sanskrit, in which substances are called upon. So we have the concoction of medicinal formulas, and mm-hmm. then ritual actions combined with incantations and meditations. So we have these three things happening, but the governing logic is really to always, throughout it all, to enlist or invoke or cajole or sometimes even threaten the spirits that inhabit the surrounding landscape to desist from their causing of illness. So this is a kind of etiology of illnesses that are said to come about through improper relationships with landscape, essentially. Mm. So what these different formulas are intended to do is to rein in the harm being caused by deities that are connected with landscape. And mm-hmm. So illness is then on a spectrum with other misfortunes. It's not an isolated thing, but part of a broader context of care and wellness that includes natural disaster, wrongful punishment, even. So legal problems, and other kinds of things. And so anyways, they're invoked to come to the aid rather than to harm. So this is sort of continuous with this idea of subjugation of Mara and the yoking of the landscape deities to the purpose of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and bringing them under the subordination of the universal benevolence of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, so that they can serve not just the Sangha, but the entire surrounding community and even the state. And so often this is done through the intermediaries of the four great kings, or the Lokapalas, who hold spiritual sovereignty over the territories and resident spirit beings present throughout the four cardinal directions. So this is part of a cosmology common to some Abhidharma depictions that some of us are aware of, I'm sure, where you have the great king Kubera, also known as Vaishravana, in the north, where he presides over the yaksha variety of what they call graha. So everything's a graha, according to these texts, or a bhuta. And these are the Sanskrit terms for the spooky spirit beings that inhabit the landscape and can do harm, but can also bring benefit if properly brought into the service of the three jewels. And so then the Dhritarashtra's in the east, and he reigns over the Gandharva grahas. Viruddhaka rules in the south, and his entourage consists of the Kumbanda grahas. And then we have Virupaksha in the west, and his entourage is the Naga grahas. And so each group of grahas, and this term, interestingly, is in Tibetan dun. So in Tibetan medicine, there's a whole kind of discussion of illnesses caused by dun. So that's directly connected to this etiological theory that's rooted in, I mean, it's expressed very clearly in these texts. It predates them, I'm sure, but its clearest articulation in one of its clearest articulations, at least, is these sets of texts where you have these grahas that are responsible for all kinds of illnesses. So each group of graha is responsible for a particular category of illness with its own unique set of physical symptoms. So illnesses have been classified in a lot of Buddhist contexts according to this fourfold cosmology presented here. And the texts are famous for articulating a kind of karmic loophole, I guess you could call it, allowing for the practice of Buddhist medicine even, or Buddhist ritual too. So the text, excuse me, let me just get a sip here.
Sure. Wait, sorry, could you just dwell a little bit more on that? When you say karmic loophole, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, thanks. So what I mean is that the texts promise that their treatment is sure to cure, or, you know, the formula and the treatment or whatever's going. So there's a lot of different treatments described in the text, often with this caveat, barring the ripening of previous karma. So this caveat effectively creates some kind of wiggle room, as it were, with respect to the law of karmic cause and effect, which would find expression in the Tibetan phrase of trelkyan, or incidental conditions, in which we can locate a conception of medicinal and ritual efficacy within the workings of karma. And so this extends a kind of hope or agency that we can gain some purchase on our fortune and health in this lifetime, and you know, to try something to remedy our situation.
Right. That's so interesting, because these texts are, you know, the 5 protections. In essence, what you're saying is, like, they're not just texts where it says, oh, you know, this will protect you, like, please protect the person who's reciting the dharani, or whatever, but it's actually pointing to possible causes of the illness or other types of problems and issues in the world. And it's saying, you know, it's actually asking for spirits to desist in their activities that might be causing the issues and obstructions. And then the texts actually provide incantations and, like, ritual, kind of actual ritual actions you can take to accomplish the act of, like, asking the spirits to desist, and then the texts themselves become a protection for the practitioner in that way. It's very interesting. It's like it's not just the recitation of a text that will protect you. It's like actually trying to point to this larger network that a person who's experiencing issues is embedded in, which is very interesting. Yeah,
absolutely. That's exactly right. And in so many ways, it's really fascinating.
Right. Yeah, it really is very fascinating. So are there things that, from your translation and study of this set of texts, are there things that you see in it that you think that strike you as maybe useful for how we approach illness and healthcare today? What's the relevance of these texts for the world at large?
Yeah, that's great. And further along the line of your reflections on this network that's built through the different facets of care enunciated in the text, I think is really the takeaway for me, at least. So provides this vision, really, that pandemics and natural disasters don't just happen to us as though we're sort of nothing but passive victims of capricious forces out there. the picture is that the five protections give is that the health and illness are facets of a complete context, essentially, of causes and conditions, in which illness and pandemic are framed as a result of imbalances in our collective ethical comportment with respect to the environment and one another. So in the Great Peahen, for instance, we're encouraged to cultivate benevolence, maitri, or loving kindness toward all creatures, and go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha to ensure that the text's mantra formulas and ritual prescriptions can cure the effects of toxins and a range of other illnesses and misfortunes. And in doing so, the Great Peahen is fascinating because it offers one of the most extensive maps of the South Asian world of landscape spirits in the history of Buddhist literature. It's just this, I mean, reading it is just dizzying. And it really maps them to very specific places. So you have named every deity in a range of different mountains, lakes, rivers, trees, and so forth. And with this notion that we have to be benevolent toward them. This one is one of the less aggressive texts. It's the destroyer of the Great Trichiliocosm, which really kind of ups the ante and gets a little bit rough. But this one is more about enlisting their help and pacifying them through peaceful means. But in the destroyer of the Great Trichiliocosm, it's the unchecked greed of the environmental grahas and bhutas, these spirits, that have been given free rein by the four world guardians, these lokapala, who are assigned with the task of controlling them, that results in a pandemic of epic proportions. So the narrative framework is really, really fascinating in that regard. So in reining them back, the text classifies illnesses according to this Indian cosmology that I described, of Meru at the center and the four cardinal direction slopes and the lokapalas governing them, the classes of spirits that dwell under their jurisdiction and so forth. And by doing that, it gives a classification of the illnesses and offers a kind of model for construing illness and its treatment as intimately interwoven with our relationships to the environment, and especially the non-human or more than human world that inhabits the environment. So treatment then becomes about resorting to means to restore collective balance and harmony ethically, not just symptomatically within the individual body, even if it sometimes involves forceful measures of drawing strict territorial boundaries around afflicted areas. And this is really pandemic crisis management techniques, and bringing the non-human world into check. And there are even very pragmatic things that are, pragmatic from our perspective. These are all seen as pragmatic, but cleaning areas of rubbish and, managing waste disposal as that are mentioned as part of the ritual procedure. So this emphasis on hygiene is very strong in these, and that's part of their classification as Kriya Tantras. So that feeds into a whole kind of pandemic crisis management logic, I think.
Yeah. So perhaps one way to see how relevant these texts are for us is to actually look at the context that the texts provide, because otherwise it's very easy for people to feel like these texts are just like about incantations or something. It's like, it feels very religious, quote unquote religious, where, you just recite something and then you'll be fine. But when you actually look at the context that's provided in these pretty short texts, you see that it's all about the environment and the landscape and what your relationship to it is. And even the kind of karmic caveat you were mentioning doesn't at all, even though you're supplicating the spirits to stop their harmful activities, it's not at all saying that alone will do the trick necessarily, right? There's like some karmic culpability as well. And it's possible that this won't work if, you haven't purified yourself in certain ways and, you haven't confessed perhaps past karmic transgressions. And then when you were talking about the grahas and sort of like the greed of the land spirits and how that leads to illness, in some ways we can see that as like I don't know, human beings being that kind of spirit almost, right? Because we know that human greed has sort of participated in or instigated a lot of these cycles that we now see, that we can now experience the effects of, whether it's pandemics or even natural catastrophes. So that's very interesting. It kind of makes you really think about like what a land spirit is. Is it really so different and separate from us? Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so those are fascinating remarks. It's so true, and when we take into account this notion that's in at least the Sarvastivada, Abhidharma and Mahayana of collective karma, and the idea that the graha world or the Bhuta world is really co-forming with ourselves. In a Buddhist vision, they're intimately intertwined karmically. So the greed, right, in a way, reflects the human greed, and the narratives are quite clear and fresh in this regard. So this in the Great Peahen, for example, it's this peacock who was Buddha in a previous lifetime that was sort of virtuous and going around and hanging around, and all of a sudden got overcome with lust for the peahens, and just got completely swept away by his lust that caused him to be captured by these kind of evil boys who capture peacocks back then. And then so it's this interesting play where all the narratives are sort of trying to reflect the human in fascinating ways. And I think we can, and we are invited actually by these narratives to read ourselves and our conditions into them, and to, in a sense, extrapolate what lessons can be learned. And I think that that collectivity and that interconnection between ethics and ethos and environment and pandemic is really a strong takeaway.
Right. Thank you for that. That's very fascinating. And I hope our participants today will sort of take some time to read the text as well and see what they find that's interesting and relevant for them today. And then maybe just moving on a bit to talk about maybe what I would call a more sort of literary aspect of this collection. You've said in the past that this collection, quote, has been one of the most resilient and adaptive sets of scriptures in the history of Buddhist literature. Can you say more about this? What did you mean by that? In what ways do they sort of exhibit this kind of resiliency and adaptiveness?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, what I mean by that, and this is true of a lot of Buddhist literature actually, but this is a particularly pointed instance of it, I would say, is that each of the texts developed independently by drawing a lot of material from earlier non-Mahayana scriptures of what we might call the Shravakayana, like Pali literature, Vinaya, Jataka, suttas, and these kinds of things. And then, as I mentioned before, by the 8th or 9th century at the latest, the 5 had been combined into a small collection that was then kind of regarded as a set of dharanis, but called sutras, so Mahayana dharanis. And then by the 10th or 11th century, the work was fully integrated into an explicit tantric fivefold mandala framework. And for me, I think it's the mundane or pragmatic emphasis of the text and the call for the integration of all 5 in ritual performances came to, like I said, constitute a kind of practical canon in use. And that implies, since it's something used a lot and put into use contextually, that it, by necessity had to be more porous and more adaptive than formal canonical texts. So this enabled it to assimilate to a lot of different contexts, ranging from, personal healing to even to statecraft. So the Great Amulet in particular actually came to be integrated into mandalas of the Yogini Tantra, so the higher tantras, like the Abhidhanottara and the Vajrapanjara. And, so for different purposes. So the aspect of, securing the health of pregnant woman and the healthy birth of children became isolated as a feature, and kind of it took off into a different direction. And then elsewhere, either alone, individually, or as a collection, they spread throughout Central Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Mongolia. And they were hugely popular everywhere for pragmatic purposes. So the Great Peahen actually was that on its own was translated 6 different times into Chinese between the 4th and the 8th centuries. And then a lot of work has been done on these the impact on Chinese Buddhism of that text. And it eventually became instrumental in not just in China, but across East Asia, for integrating Buddhist and indigenous notions of divine kingship, and for adapting Indian Buddhist models of sacred geography, the spirit world, and pathology and healing to native Chinese conceptions, which were already very highly developed by the time these texts were introduced. So then when Tibetans first received the set of texts in the 9th century, the process of their tantric transformation was really not complete at all, like I was talking about before. Looking at the first few centuries of the reception of these texts in Tibet, I think really highlights this transformational capacity of the texts and their adaptability to a lot of different practice contexts. And then that can reflect in turn, I mean, for research purposes, developments in Indian Tantra from the 8th to the 12th century. So, I think this can really also contribute a lot to understanding this connection that we find, especially in Tantra, but throughout the Buddhist traditions, I think, between the pragmatic and the ultimate orientations. So it's a thread that runs throughout, sometimes in tension, and there's always this interplay, of course, throughout the tradition. So some of this work has been done, like Todd Lewis has a great book on, or a great chapter, actually. It's a very long chapter on the 5 and how they are in Newar Buddhism, how they figured in Newar Buddhism. And then Charles Orzek and Ryan Overby and Paul Kopp. These are all in the bibliographies of the translations too, so you can find them there if you don't want to note them. They've studied their role in Chinese Buddhism a lot, but research on their role in Tibet is really very little, actually. Some art historical research, but aside from that, not much.
So when you say art historical research, are there quite a lot of images representing the 5 protections and the goddesses personified, or
there really are quite a lot in Tibet, and also statuary, but especially in Nepal on manuscripts, so illuminated manuscripts. There's loads of images.
That's I like how you sort of talk about the collection as an example of the way sort of very pragmatic texts become integrated into Buddhist culture over time. This is just one example of many, but the kind of, when you mentioned that the Sakyapa scholar like Shakya Chogden had written on this as well, you really see how they're not seeing ritual and scholasticism or philosophy as being binaries. They're really embracing the whole spectrum, right? So even texts like these that deal with incantations and kind of very pragmatic issues with ritual approaches are also embraced by some of the greatest scholars in Tibetan history, because they see it as being part of the same system. They don't see it as being separate from it, even if you can there are sometimes tensions that you can sense in the literature that we have on these texts. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And this really flies in the face of some of our tendency to dissect knowledge into little compartments, having sort of ritual and stuff over here, kind of, maybe connected to the, I don't know, the unseen realm and superstition, even in a pejorative sense, and then religion and philosophy and science and so forth, kind of all neatly demarcated. Yeah, these great thinkers were way beyond these sort of facile compartmentalizations. That's a really great point. And they really invite us to question our categories, I think, and it's wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now I want to ask you about a very interesting connection that you've made in the past. You have said that there is a connection between the 5 protections, the set of texts that we're talking about, and terma, or treasure literature in Tibet. Can you tell us more about that? What is the connection that you see between the 5 protections and the terma tradition in Tibet?
Yeah, thanks for that question. This to me is a further extension of this adaptability that I was talking about just earlier. And for me, it started, I guess you could say, with like a lot of things for me in terms of research, with Soktopaloder Gyaltsen, this guy that I studied for my thesis, because he's got a lot of apologetic texts, you could say, defending his Nyingma tradition, old school tradition, against criticisms, especially the amulet tradition. So this idea of liberation through wearing that you find in the Nyingma school primarily. So he enlists the great amulet as a kind of example, an Indian example of the kind of thing that liberation through wearing is doing. And then we find also Pao Tsuklak Trengwa, this great Kagyu teacher, this author of A Feast for Scholars, this Kebigatan history in the 16th century. He also makes reference to it. So I started thinking, oh, well, maybe there's some kind of, further connection, or some kind of more, intertextual connection between these texts and terma literature. So I started fishing around and doing some research, and found that, in fact, especially the Great Amulet figures in the 14th century treasure revealer Sangye Lingpa's Lama Gongdu cycle, and also in Chogyur Lingpa's Zapa Kordun. So these are just really, 19th century. And what makes that interesting is that they're considered sort of a reincarnation line, actually. So, Sangye Lingpa is considered to be a pre-incarnation of Chogyur Lingpa. And then a third figure kind of shows up on the horizon of Shikpo Lingpa in the 16th century as also having treasure revelations that are inflected by the influence of the Great Amulet. And especially in terms of pragmatic goals of producing progeny for sponsors, and for ensuring the safe delivery of children and the health of mother and child. So you have the Great Amulet figuring in the mantra and mention of the Sanskrit Mahapratisara in the transliterated Sanskrit. And, in these three, in the different termas of these 3 tertons that are, part of an incarnation line, which I found absolutely fascinating. You don't have much. The great peahen figures a little bit in terma too, but you don't have a whole mandala set like you do in the Sarma traditions or the new schools, as it were. But you have this influence, which I found fascinating. And and then they're integrated also, especially in Chogyur Lingpa's treasures, into a kind of higher tantric context, just like they were in India, where all of a sudden the Great Amulet is part of a set, is a wisdom dakini, no longer pragmatic or worldly dakini, but a dakini. First, she wasn't a dakini, but then she's a dakini, and not just any kind, but a wisdom dakini. So it's that progression, and that malleability and adaptability kind of continues into the treasure tradition. So it's fascinating.
Wow. And this is the Great Amulet, right?
Yeah.
So the Great Amulet is actually mentioned as a wisdom dakini in Chogyur Lingpa's terma text.
Yeah. Yep.
That's really interesting. Wow.
I know. It's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. I hope you write about this. We're, we eagerly await your publications on this subject. It's very
Oh,
interesting.
thank you. Yeah, I gave some
Yeah.
paper on that a few years ago, but then I kind of
Yeah.
put it to the side. But
Yeah.
this inspires me to get to it.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Are there other ways in which you see the influence and legacy of these texts today? Obviously, they're part of important terma tradition, so I'm sure they're still sort of in practice in one way or another. But are there other ways in the Tibetan context or otherwise where you see the influence and legacy of the five protections?
Yeah, I think they continue to be transmitted in the Sakya tradition. So, in the top Kundu, you have sections of especially the Great Peahen is part of that, but others are part of that as well in the Terma tradition, as you mentioned, but really it's in the Newar Buddhist tradition that you can witness very popular propitiation of the five and all kinds of rituals that center the five. So Newar Buddhist communities, Kathmandu, have also translated the collection into the modern vernacular. So they've taken it into the vernacular, and they do a number of annual rituals too. So it's part of the annual calendar, ritual calendar for Newar Buddhists. And again, for a broad range of pragmatic ends, but yoked to a broader Buddhist doctrinal understanding of what that is. So again, Todd Lewis's book, Popular Buddhist Texts from Nepal, is a really great source for that. He's got this great chapter on it, and he translated actually little ritual texts and narratives from the vernacular in that book also.
I'm trying to see if I can share one of the images you had that you sent to me. I think it's from Nepal, of the five protections mandala.
Oh yeah.
Let me see if I can share so that our participants can see. Yeah, this is quite a beautiful image. And so this is in the center is who, the destroyer of the Trichiliocosm, or who is in the center?
It's the Great Amulet.
That great amulet. Okay. Yeah. That's really beautiful. I really love these Newari paintings.
Yeah, that's gorgeous.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to stop share. Okay, great. And maybe to close, before we take questions from the audience, could you share with us maybe a verse or a phrase or something from the Five Protections collection that you personally have found to be especially meaningful or beautiful or interesting? Just could you point us to something in the text?
Sure. Yeah, I would love to. I picked out a passage that I think from the Destroyer of the Great Trichiliocosm that I think illustrates a lot of the dynamics that we were talking about. It's a bit lengthy. I mean, it's a couple of paragraphs, but it's very hard to extract meaningful bits from the text. You have to kind of read into it. But I can read it for everybody if you think that's...
Would you like to share your screen as well if you're in the reading room?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, that way everyone can see the text while you're reading it. That would be great.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just minimize this. So I'll start here, and I'll break here and there if there's need for commentary. But this is toward the end of the text, after all the incantations have been said to quell a pandemic of cosmic proportions that swept across not just Earth but everywhere. So then, with palms joined, the four great kings, and now these are the four Lokapalas that are being sort of the intermediaries for this healing process, said to the Blessed One, Venerable Blessed One, this Dharma teaching, the King of Sutras, destroyer of the Great Trichiliocosm, is the Buddha seal that delivers from all grahas. Whoever observes the bases of training, so this is the Buddhist training here, dons the saffron-colored robes, and receives, holds, recites aloud, explains, masters, writes out, binds into a book, and wears it, will be unaffected by any inauspicious phenomena, ranging from illness, peril, misfortune, disease, disturbance, fighting, contention, bondage, argument, and dissension, and slander. They will overcome all harm. Now here we get to a ritual procedure that's quite interesting. Villages, towns, regions, the kingdom, crossroads, and homes should be cleansed of heaps of rubbish. So this pragmatic sort of cleaning of the area by one seeking to demarcate the kingdom's borders, who has performed his ablutions, seeks the 3 white foods, abstains from the 5 impure foods, and this refers mostly to meat, but other things too. Observes the bases of human training, again, Buddhist training, possesses equanimity for all beings, and is adorned with fine garments and jewelry. The ground at the center of the king's palace should be strewn with flower petals and scented with various fragrances. In the 4 directions should be placed 4 girls who have performed their ablutions. They should be well adorned and hold weapons in their hands. Each of them should also have a bell and a jewel vessel. In the morning, when the sun has risen, the incantation should be read out loud and the sutras should be recited and chanted. It should be written out and fastened to the tops of large shrines, tall trees, and tall standards, and then worshipped for up to half a lunar month with various flowers and fragrances. It should be chanted once each day. Thus the kingdom will be delivered. Thus the villages, cities, regions, county, kingdom, palaces, sacred sites, temples, homes, fields, government offices, trees, orchards, meadows, gardens, cowsheds, and stables will be divested of heaps of rubbish. Kabira and juju wood should be lit, the ground should be strewn with flower petals, and the porticos should be scented with various fragrances to the right and left. All seeds should be smeared with clarified butter and scattered to the 4 directions. Threads of various colors should be tied to the passageways. All the animals should be released and then rounded up again. The incantation should be chanted. It should be written out or bound into a book, fastened to some high place, and then worshipped. In front of the patient, a Buddha image, a Buddha reliquary, or an image of Brahma and Shakra or the 4 great kings should be placed on a stool or on a casket and marked with the 4 seals. The 3 jewels should be worshipped with various flowers and fragrances, and in the names of Brahma, Shakra, the 4 great kings, Maheshwara, the Yaksha generals, the Yaksha warriors, Hariti, and so forth. By their power, majesty, and might, may I have well-being, may I be protected, may I be delivered from all illnesses. All of the patient's food, drink, and medicine should be bestowed, enchanted with this incantation. So this final part is for the personal patient, right? And the first part is for the collective. And so that to me encapsulates the dynamics.
Wow. Thank you for your wonderful translation too. It really kind of encapsulates the power of the text, I think. And what really struck me about that is, the text doesn't say, the cause of your illness is that the city is dirty, it's not hygienic, and you're not making things nice, right? The text doesn't say that, but the text just tells you clean the rubbish, sort of there's clean the rubbish, do all these things, make the place nice, make your surroundings, your land nice. And then when you fasten this on the tree, fasten this on here, there, it's also bringing your awareness to the natural environment. You have to really make everything around you nice, and by doing so you will be cured of the disease. It doesn't kind of draw the causation that clearly, but that's what struck me. It's it's not just saying chant this and you'll get protection. It's saying, okay, you're sick. Okay, now you have to do all these things. Part of it is ritual incantation and things like that, and making offerings with rituals. But part of it is also just wake up. You need to make your surroundings nice if you don't want to be sick, and that can be very sort of just on the level of germs, but also on the level of your relationship as a human being to your environment. It's very powerfully kind of woven together in that excerpt that you read to us.
Yeah. Thank you for those great observations. It's so true. And I mean, to your point also, I love how even at the very end, you start to think, oh, well, this is just some kind of magical procedure where they're setting up a statue or whatever to cure the patient. But then you're incanting the medicine. So it's kind of including other forms of healthcare that aren't explicit in the text as part of its general context of awareness. And, like you said, drawing attention to all of these environmental factors and even the food and drink and the medicine that the patient should be consuming as part of the treatment. So encapsulating kind of layers of healthcare oriented awareness, tying it to the environment, tying it to the cosmology and pantheons of surrounding deities. Even the high Hindu deities are part of the scene.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe we'll take some questions from the audience now. So we have 2 questions from Reno Praditya. The first question is just whether one needs initiation before we can use the 5 protections texts. And then the second question is about whether these texts talk about the incantations or the ritual practices being effective because of the emptiness of the illness in the sick person. So I guess the second question is about whether the texts talk about sickness in that way. Does it use the rhetoric of emptiness to explain sickness or not?
Great. Yeah, those are wonderful questions. Thank you. In terms of initiation, there is a tradition in Tibet, at least, as part of the Druptap Kuntu, I believe, of initiation for all of these or part of these. Maybe someone else in the audience knows more about it who attended the recent Druptap Kuntu transmission. But as Kriya tantras that sort of have this more Mahayana background, they're sort of on the cusp of requiring or not requiring that. They came to require that. For sure. Like in Newar Buddhism, there is an initiation into their propitiation, but it's also the case that the Pañcarakṣā rituals in the 5 protections rituals in Newar Buddhism are held publicly too. So there's sort of a public dimension to the practice. I mean, that really is part of the healthcare approach, as well as an esoteric side to it. That's part of their later development. So it's hard to really pinpoint them because of their development historically. But I'd say in the Tibetan tradition now, they're definitely part of an initiation structure. So like in the Choling Tersar, there's a 4-fold initiation in which the great amulet is embedded in.
Let's see. And then their second question was about emptiness of illness in the sick person. Is that something we find in the text?
Not explicitly. It seems that the clinical setting is foregrounded. So the clinical setting in the sense of the perspective of the sick person, I feel, is foregrounded more than the perspective of the doctrine. But you do have doctrinal notions that are part of it. So, but it's not instructed that the patient should reflect on emptiness per se. But some doctrinal notions that ebb up against emptiness or connected with emptiness are invoked as part of the healing procedure. So it's not necessarily contemplative in the sense that we might think ordinarily these days, but more or less along the lines of words of truth, proclamations of truth that have a reality effect.
All right. So the next question we have is from Alexandra Ilieva. And they ask, they said, thanks for the fascinating talk. And given the prominence of the discourse today, at least in the English-speaking world, about the prevalence of mental illnesses and the importance of mental health awareness, just generally speaking, they're wondering if these texts mention illnesses of the mind. And if so, how are those types of illnesses discussed?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. Yes, all kinds of mental illnesses are discussed in these texts. and they are framed as continuous with the physical illnesses and with natural disasters and other kinds of misfortunes. So the grahas are responsible for a range of different illnesses that are kind of you could say psychophysiological along a spectrum, that we might think of it as along a spectrum these days, which gives an interesting, I think, insight into not just etiology from that period or from when these texts were formed, but also in terms of mind-body relationality and how intimate that connection is in the Buddhist traditions. So that's a fascinating issue. Nowadays, I think with the encounters with biomedicine, when Tibetan doctors speak of the graha or dun in Tibetan, these spirits that cause illness, often that's framed along the psychological spectrum. So because we have a kind of, the encounter with biomedicine has caused a certain kind of distancing between the mental and the physical in some respect, although of course that's bridged more and more these days in biomedicine. But traditionally, I don't think any such distinction was necessarily held, at least in these texts. You can't detect a sort of a way in which the mental side and the physical side are being disentangled.
I see. And that presents us with a different way to view illness of any kind as well, of just how the sort of, the mind body is not so distinct as the way biomedicine would like to sort of think about it sometimes. Although you're right, it's moving towards an integration as well. Okay, now we have a series of very interesting questions from Daniel W. 3 questions. The first is that the Mahamayuri, the great peahen, and the Mahapratisara, which is the great amulet, are especially popular in East Asian Buddhism. So how has the 5 protections, or the Pañcarakṣā collection, or any similar combination of texts been used in other Mahayana traditions, such as those from China or Japan? Perhaps I'll let you answer the first one first. It's the first question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Both are. I am not that aware that of the use of the complete mandala, the whole collection, in China or Japan, although I wouldn't discount it. But what we have, it seems that the Mahamayuri and the Mahapratisara were translated separately into Chinese. I mean, somebody else, maybe can correct me on this. And you're so right. They became hugely popular in East Asian Buddhism because of their influence in China first. But I haven't read any research, and myself have not conducted any research that's speaking about the integration of these texts in the Mahayana traditions. And that could just be, I mean, maybe in Japan that happened, or maybe in China, but I'm not quite sure actually. And I would say that the way they're treated in the later Indian commentarial literature, especially we have the Abhayakaragupta and Ratnakarashanti's work. So these are 11th, 12th century figures who were really invested in, I mean, they're writing on Kriya, but they're writing, in a sense, integrating Kriya Tantras already into higher Tantric contexts. And these didn't make a splash exactly in China. And so we're not transmitted to Japan, as far as I know, because what we have in Japan in terms of esoteric Buddhism is coming from the Tang Dynasty period, from an earlier period. So it doesn't seem, I would guess at least, that they wouldn't have had as strong of an influence there, but maybe others know more.
And then the second question from Daniel is, what's the difference between, so Daniel was looking at the Tohoku catalog, and the Great Peahen is Tohoku 559, And then Tohoku 560, the next text, is the essence of the Pihen, the Mayuri Vidya Garbha. So he's asking what's the difference between those texts? I guess, are they related texts, or are they just put next to each other because they have Pihen in the title?
Yeah, they are related. The essence of the Pihen is just a Dharani formula extracted from what they call the Vidya Rajni, the Queen incantation or something like this. So you have a lot of these in the Kangyur collection where you'll have the main texts, which are often called a Vidya Rajni or something like this, or Sutra. And then you'll have, the essence, which is really talking about a mantra formulation or some kind of excerpt that's considered to be something that you can take out and kind of use in different contexts. So that speaks to this practical canon in use idea that I was talking about. And so you have other things like, the mantra excerpted is explicitly for incanting medicines. That's another thing. And we have a translation of that up already, I think, by Catherine Dalton, and of one of these texts. And so there's a bunch of these kind of floating around. So the five and then little derivative excerpts that make it into the Kangyur separately. Right.
Yeah, that does happen a lot in the Kangyur. So Daniel, to answer your question, Tohoku 560 is an extract of a incantation from the Great Pihen. And this happens a lot in the canon, as James just said. And then a third and final question from Daniel is that in the Great Cool Grove, it stipulates abstinence from molasses, honey, sesame, meat, and fish. So what is the reason for foods such as molasses and sesame being included in this list of prohibited substances? Are they associated with spirits in some way?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I don't have the answer to. Maybe somebody else in the audience can speak to this, because especially molasses is used as a medicine too. Same with honey. Sesame is often used medicinally as well. Also different animal meats are part of Tibetan medicine, at least. So I'm not sure of the logic there, and that's something that would require more research into different I think Kriya conceptions of purity are really, so Kriya tantras have a whole conception of purity and hygiene. It's very much associated with the symbolic associations and other associations of substances and their origins, who handled them, perhaps, and all kinds of other considerations. So these kinds of tantras also stipulate special astrologically auspicious times to do different rituals, bodily hygiene, so cleaning yourself and wearing very fresh clothing, and the color white, white foods and things like this. So it could have something to do with notions of purity and pollution, but I'm not sure exactly what they are with those. But that's that's an interesting thread, though, that somebody ought to do research into.
Right. Somebody should write a paper about it. Someone in the audience. We would love to know. All right. Daniel says thank you for your answers. And then finally, we have a question from Eugene Lau, who wants to know a little bit more about the iconography of these goddesses in the five protections. Seems like many of them are multi-armed goddesses. Can you just tell us something about the iconography or the representation of them?
Yeah, this is a great question. There's a scholar by the name of I'll just cite him because he's really the expert on this, named Gerd Mevison. Maybe I can share.
Yeah, maybe. Would you be able to type it in the chat, perhaps?
Yeah. Because just got
I
so
don't know
many
how to
papers
spell
on
that.
this. Yeah, sure. Here, I'll just type it here.
Yeah.
Gerd Mevison. And I'm probably not pronouncing his name properly either. But you can find a lot of his works on academia.edu, where he's really spent number of years examining the iconography and the Indic iconography of these goddesses, actually, and their associations. So they become associated with the five Buddhas, essentially. So the famous five Buddhas of Ratnasambhava, Vairochana, Amoghasiddhi, Yakshobhya, Amitabha.
Are they considered their consorts or just goddesses that are,
It's not clear whether they're consort. Probably eventually they do. And the great source for the later iconography is Abhaya Karagupta's Nishpana Yogavali. So this is I don't know if it, anyways, Abhaya Karagupta, I'll just type in here. It's a compendia that's of different iconographies, sadhanas, essentially. So it's a sadhana iconography, and you can look into that for the later iconography. But yeah, they get color coded correspondingly. And so then, whichever ones correspond with these five, and then directionally, of course, and all these associations with the five. So this is happening really in the 12th century, 13th century and on. But in terms of, so there's different iconography. There's a lot of detail to know about the iconography that I just haven't explored. But Gerd Mevisan is really wonderful, and you can see that he's written. I mean, he's got at least 10 articles on Academia EDU devoted to the topic. So please, I encourage you to look there. And sorry that I can't say more about it.
No, that's great. So Eugene, if you're interested in the iconography, please look up the articles by Gerd Mevisan. Thank you for pointing us to that resource, James. All right, I don't see any more questions from the audience. Are there any more questions? We can wait like 1 minute to see if any more questions come in. Eugene says, thank you for the reference to Gerd.
You're welcome.
Let's see. Pema, is there a question from Alexandra? Oh, I think we answered that question from Alexandra already. All right. If there are no more questions, James, do you have anything else you want to say in conclusion in terms of the five protections, or do you feel like you've kind of covered what you wanted to say?
I think I've probably said too much about it.
Oh no!
But I would just encourage everybody to take a look at those texts and to read them. I mean, and just with the caveat that no translation is ever perfect and final and complete, and once and forevermore. But just to look at those and to see how they speak to you, just to interact with them personally, and to see what the impact that they might have on you as readers, and and it's always fun to do as Buddhists do and recite them out loud, read them out loud. It's very interesting, even if you don't necessarily believe in the efficacy of doing so. they're telling us to do so. So why not read them in the way that they're telling us to read them? So it's fun to do that, and in my classes I always have students doing that, and they really like it, they enjoy it, and it's a different kind of experience reading a text out loud slowly and rhythmically to yourself or in a group or something like that.
Right. There's something about treating a text the way it wants to be treated. It reminds me of like Shakespeare, right? It's great to study Shakespeare in English class, but then go see a Shakespearean play, right? That gives you a totally different dimension and experience of it. So in this case, the five protection texts are saying like, recite me out loud, like recite this out loud. So sort of to get the full dimension of the text, perhaps, you have to recite it out loud and just see what it does. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, James, so much for being part of this conversation this morning. And thank you to everyone for joining. Please visit the 84,000 Translating the Words of the Buddha website, join the mailing list if you're interested in more events, and please visit the reading room to read the 5 protections and a whole slew of other translations. And there are more translations being rolled out all the time. So please stay tuned. And thank you all so much. We hope everyone stays well and happy, and see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joy, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.